Welcome to Live One TV from New York. Today we're going to talk with Clark Worswick. Worswick is a leading expert who has rescued 19th century photographic histories of Asia, both as historian, curator, collector, and filmmaker with a career spanning decades. He has authored and co-authored several influential books that helped bring early photography from colonial and imperial Asia to wider attention. Key works include The Last Empire, Photography in British India, 1855 to 1911, Imperial China, as well as Japan, Photographs 1854 to 1905. He received an Indo-American Fellowship from the Smithsonian Institute and has been a collector whose materials and photographs of China and Southeast Asia are held in institutions like the Getty Research Institute.
Number 3 that we're doing, I think perhaps should be called Artland, the creation of rarity and what photography measures and creates scarcity in. Mm-hmm. So basically, what we're talking about here is that, like many things that mankind creates, art is a unique object created by artisans. And the artisans, in each epoch, have their own media that they work in and on time frame and reasons for doing the art, from the cave paintings of Lascaux done 30,000 BC in France to what you may be doing on your kitchen table, creating, the art world of the app. I think what's really interesting about the art world is that people really essentially don't understand, and they do understand. Everybody knows what I'm going to say, but they just perhaps haven't put it together. How art is measured and valued in our period, being from it was a period of Greeks in the 5th century BC to the present day, I believe, is how rare something is and how elevated it is, and how it is a wonderful communication device that everyone can understand. And each epoch of mankind's time has different arts. And the interesting point about our world, which, let's say it began, the European world, began its cultural transformation in the late medieval period of 12th century Europe, and with the construction of the great Gothic churches. And those churches were covered with statues made by artisans, sculptors, and they had heavy religious connotations. And the community created these constructions with forced or unforced labor over decades of time, or even centuries in some cases. And out of that art period of, say, the 12th century to 13th century, 14th century, there grew a group of merchants who were trading in various places, and they had most of the revenue of all the kings and queens and the church and all the social organizations that had created repositories of gold or precious gems or great textiles or even lands and titles and everything else. Well, property became, during the medieval period in Europe, the sign of great prosperity. And that's not to say that the same thing didn't happen China during the second millennium BC, or Nor-India in the 1000 BC. But in Europe, the mercantile class began measuring their prosperity by commissioning artists to work for them. And they created either religious objects or decorative objects that had a certain scarcity to them. And there was a winnowing process there amongst the artists, who were the greatest artists and who had the greatest patronage. And so you get the church involved, and the Medicis, and all the great religious leaders of the Roman Catholic establishment. You have the kings and queens of Europe having court artists, and it came in time that the churches just were so full of art created in 300-400 years that new art replaced old art, but for the same reasons it had been created. And the European history winnowed down the numbers of art objects because of wars and famines and all sorts of other things. And all sorts of other things would be an example of Cortez conquered Mexico and began to ship gigantic quantities of art objects created by the great Inca civilization and the great Aztec civilization, and going back 2,000, 3,000 years in the New World. All this art came onto the world market through the shipment of gold from both Peru and Mexico in Spanish galleons. So when this art, I'm just giving an example of the vicissitudes of art. When this art arrived in the Spanish court, it was some of the most naturalistic, wonderful art that European artists themselves had ever seen. Durer, the great German painter, was a court painter in the Spanish court, and he left a description of the naturalism of the great loot that was coming in from the New World. And what happened to the bulk of this art was that it was all melted up as bullion content. If you can imagine, I mean, this is one of the greatest cataclysms in the history of art. Very, very difficult to think about it today, what had been just thrown away, essentially, if not trampled. And a similar kind of thing, no one realizes this, I know very few people realize this, is that in Byzantium, the surviving Roman Empire, I'll get back to the Roman Empire in a moment, in a period of, I believe, the 8th century, had this cataclysmic reevaluation of figurative objects which depicted human beings. And this whole tradition of naturalistic art, which had gone on at that point for 1,300 years, maybe 1,500 years, from the time of Greece, and before that from Egypt, was all called into question. So in places like the Hagia Sophia, the great church, which had been, it was Constantine's church, built in Byzantium. All the walls were scrubbed and painted over. All the great art that had been created inside that fantastic building was just whitewashed. All that art that had been created over the last 500 years, 200 years, 300 years was just erased. I mean, it's just a terrible cataclysm. Nobody ever realizes, why that happened. Well, it was because Christianity said it's a very bad thing to have people worshiping human figures, essentially. It is something that Islam, at the same time, Muhammad was beginning to preach. He adopted that idea in Islam from the Byzantines. And the great tragedy of all of that thought was that you had gigantic amounts of art just disappear. In the restoration of Hagia Sophia, they peel back some of those layers, and we can see finally, what some of that art used to be. And it's as large a tragedy as what happened with the gold and objects of the conquest of Mexico and Peru. And as a little addenda, I'd say that Bishop Landa, who was Bishop of Mexico, went around Mexico after the conquest and collected a 6-foot pile of Mayan codexes, which basically was a description of their entire universe, their world. And he put them into a pyre and he burned them all. And I think of the codexes, there are like 2 that have somehow survived out of probably hundreds. In any case, getting back to the present day, how does photography fit in this this long kind of, I suppose it's a monetary appreciation of the value of art. How did we evolve to a point where a painting by Rembrandt could be sold for $450 million, which was actually bought by a Saudi royal. And the New York School of Painters, Pollock, Mark Roscoe, the people who worked in New York during the 1950s and 1940s, their paintings have risen in value to somewhere between $200 million and $275 million for a single painting. And it's a kind of curiosity of the art world that what has emerged as the most rare monetary object in our period are in fact art objects. And I think this is a really very interesting development. And to show you how quickly this develops, there's some friends of mine who owned a painting which was put up at Christie's last year by a French artist named Rousseau. Rousseau's paintings there are two Rousseaus. The Rousseau in question, his paintings are very naturalistic and very surreal and quite wonderful. This painting went up for auction, and I think it was the high-priced object in the auction at Christie's. It sold for something like $48 million. This is just last year. About 10 blocks away, 20 blocks away, there was an auction about a half a block away from where I live now in New York, which saw a painting go up for sale, and it made $235 million. And, I'm sort of saying to myself, oh my goodness, I mean, this is just extraordinary that art objects have become the new currency of our period. And so I think this is something that's going to continue onwards because lots of things in the financial world have conspired to degrade currency and bonds and treasury bills and stocks and even gold bullion. And I was told by a friend of mine who was the head gold trader at J.P. Morgan, when I was talking about gold stocks about 25 years ago, I said, well, these gold has really gotten very, very precious, from $28 to $35 an ounce in the 1930s when Roosevelt confiscated America's gold. And then it was in 2000, having this conversation with my friend, he said, well, the problem with gold is very simple, is that for every ounce of gold in the world, there are 2,000 paper pledges against that ounce. So, the spread between what reality is and what the price of gold is very, very iffy. And so I come back to, thinking about rarity, and I just conclude my small thoughts about this, that the new currency of the world in the last, say, 40 years has really devolved upon the fact that art objects are the new currency of the world, and their value continues to increase because there's a very limited supply of them. And these objects are fraught with the great problem of the art world, which is comps. If you sell a painting for $80 million, the likelihood of a work by that artist is not going to be $49. Where another object of the same artist is discovered in the lawn sale, it's not going to be $48. It's going to be millions. Mm-hmm. And this is why this is all happening, I believe. Mm-hmm. Now, if I could move on to...
before you do, though, if I can just remember, you had told me that you wanted to do less ums.
Yes, sorry.
No, I wouldn't apologize. With some people, it gets in the way of their message. It doesn't interfere with what you're saying. I'll tell you that, though. There I am doing it, too. But you mentioned it. But anyway, so it's hard to immediately stop doing that. It's a habit, built up over the years, and I do it as well, and so does everybody else do it. But you'd mentioned it in one of our earlier recordings. But before we move on to the next subject, so do you think that whereas during the Nixon administration, the U.S. dollar before Nixon had been pegged to gold, they unpegged the U.S. dollar to gold, and I think pegged it to the Saudi barrel of oil. And then right now people say, well, since many nations are buying and selling oil and they're not using U.S. dollars, the U.S. currency really isn't pegged to anything except for maybe the U.S. military and death robots. It sounds like you're saying that actually it looks like it's getting pegged to artwork.
Correct.
Yeah.
And the thing is, a barrel of oil is not fungible. I mean, nobody can say, oh, I'm here to collect, my barrel of oil. What the hell are you going to do then? They probably weigh, 800 pounds, a barrel of oil? Mm-hmm. You need like 8 people to lift it into a pickup truck, to take it home. The thing about this rarity of art objects is what you're measuring basically is something called fungibility. And the fungibility is simply, can you trade this and be paid for whatever you're selling? And I'm sorry to say the ums and ahs. The problem in going and sketching out a history of monetary equivalence is that you're going across so many areas of history, from China, in the 2nd century, 200 BC or 1000 BC, and then going to India, and then going to Constantinople, and there's just so much information. It's hard for me to collect all that and put it into a sentence.
Yeah, it doesn't get in the way.
That's so that this is my brain kind of trying to process this information.
Right. Yeah.
And when I talk next, about the rarity of photography, it's much more linear for me because I just know it so well. So I can it's like a conversation. I just say, oh, but there's this and this and this and this. Anyway.
Yeah, it sounds like also the listener takes a break or takes a breath for a moment, absorb what's just been said, point or take a breath, and then the next thing.
I'd never thought of that either, Ian. That's a good point, and thank you. I think one of the interesting things that I'd like to talk about is how casually we have taken for granted the rarity of photography and the specialness of it. I think the easiest way into describing the rarity of photography and how casually we treat its history and its importance in our lives is to go back to when I was 11 or 12 years old in Berkeley when I grew up. I grew up in this wonderful city on a hill full of professors who come there, and Mrs. Hearst, Phoebe Hearst, had decided that she was going to create a great university in Berkeley, California. I don't know why she decided on Berkeley. Maybe she just liked the surrounding hills and, liked the little stream that ran through Berkeley into the bay. In any case, over time, say from 1900 to about 1950, when the story begins, Berkeley had assembled Dr. Robert Gordon Sproul, who was the head of Berkeley for many years, had assembled a wonderful coterie of Nobel Prize winners on his campus. He had 13 Nobel Prize winners working as professors at his university. And it's just an extraordinary kind of agglomeration of talent. If I can go back to that same period, 1950, when I discovered these photographs, I used to deliver newspapers to Dorothea Lange, who was one of the great photographers of America during the 20th century, who worked during the Depression and documented the agrarian American catastrophe. And on the other side, I delivered newspapers to Dr. Edward Teller, who developed the H-bomb. And he taught it at Berkeley, and these were people that I grew up with their kids, and it's a wonderful, wonderful place to grow up. So I would wander around the campus as a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old. It was my playground, and it was, I don't know, a mile or something to the university, up and down the Berkeley hills, and I was down behind one of the buildings at the university, which is sort of on the plains, and the hills of Berkeley are above the university. And the reason I say that is because whatever I found on my journeys, I found interesting things, and I dragged them back home, and that's how I suppose I became a collector. But one day I was looking at this trash bin, and I saw these pictures that had just been thrown away in the trash bin. And I kind of looked at them, and I said, well, these are really, really interesting pictures. What are they of? I have no idea. I've never seen anything like this. So I took them out of the bin. There were like 20, 30 of them, and took them home, started looking at them. And only over a period of time did I actually figure out what these photographs were. It actually took me probably 40 years to figure out what they were. What they were was 19th century photographs taken between, say, 1860 to about 1885. And they documented Imperial China as it was and had been since, say, 2000 BC. And they've been thrown away in the trash. And I had no idea about really what they were, or why they'd wound up in the trash. But there's a marvelous story in all of this, is that during the period of maybe 1950 to about, let's say, 1980, in that 30-year period, many of the institutions of the West, meaning Europe and America, had been collecting things for a long time. And photography, when it was invented in the 1840s, was begun to be collected in, say, 1848. And from 1848 to, say, 1948, these collections had grown and grown and grown and grown because people had gone to China, and they'd gone, all over the Middle East, and they'd gone to South America. They traveled everywhere. And many of these places were photographed. And the photographs came back, and the people who eventually inherited, the travelers or the professors or the bankers or the people who had a reason to be in Hong Kong or Africa or wherever, didn't know what to do with these photographs, so they gave them to local institutions. Well, the people in the institutions didn't have an idea at all of what they really were. Because everyone in these academic institutions was in a winnowing process themselves at universities of figuring out what disciplines were actually important and what were unimportant. And phrenology, as a reading the shape of people's skulls, was something that not everybody felt deserved a university department or a museum department. And so what happened was these institutions were just drowning in photography, which nobody thought really had very much importance. It wasn't an art. In 1950, there were how many programs that studied the history of photography and granted a degree in any aspect of the history of photography? None whatsoever. The first PhD in photographic history, I believe, was granted in the very late 1960s. Nobody had studied this field. There were very few books. There were none of the appurtenances of academic merit, had been checked. So those little boxes, and so photography was this kind of no man's land, not thought of as very important at all. And the poor artists who were making photographs were, not taken very seriously, and just struggled through lives of, neglect, really. And the people who were the most prosperous photographers were photographers who worked out a way to be paid, such as Edward Steichen, who took photographs of models and, high society and all sorts of, famous people. And kind of coincided with the whole art and design world discovering appliances of the Industrial Revolution that, could be documented and then put into glossy magazines like car ads and, all of the whole advertising world that developed from the 1920s onwards. So you had a situation where the world's first fashion photographer took the first fashion photograph on his wedding trip to Ceylon, and it was a picture of his wife, Olga, who was an illegitimate daughter of the British king, posing in front of some elephants in Central Salon, and it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous photograph. And that is the first fashion photographs that I really can identify. And de Meyer himself became one of the great fashion photographers of the 20s and 30s. And the interesting thing about photography is it really did not become a legitimate art until a few things happened in the art world. And there's a kind of primacy here. In 1936, Walker Evans, the great Walker Evans, I think one of America's three great photographers of the 20th century, created his own show at a new museum which was just starting in New York. And he was allowed to put up on the walls and select the photographs he wanted. He mounted the show, and it was the first photography show that the Museum of Modern Art ever did at this property that the Rockefellers had endowed in 50th Street in the center of Manhattan. At the same time, things like this were happening. You have this strange kind of sort of half-life of universities taking up modern art, and that then spilled into a few universities having a kind of slow burning interest in photography. And there was something called Cal Arts, which developed in San Francisco at that period in the 1940s, mid-1940s, where Dorothea Lange, my neighbor in Berkeley, and Ansel Adams and a few others started this modern art college in San Francisco. And there was a course in photography. At the same time, in London, a couple, the Gernsheims, began collecting objects that they found in antique shops all over England, starting in the 1930s, and put together a really marvelous, huge collection. And then they wrote the first large history of photography book that the curator of, I believe, an assistant curator of maybe the Museum of Modern Art, Beaumont Newhall, an American academic, began writing his history of photography. So slowly, there became an academic basis for the history of photography, and people slowly began to actually look at pictures and notice that they really photographs documented the world in a way that was new and fresh and ever renewing, and every generation had a different iteration of photography. And it seems strange because at this point, photography had already existed for 100 years. And nobody had actually ever worked out a history of photography. And certainly the art galleries didn't show photography. And there were no academics studying photography. So all of this kind of exploded into an interest in photography, which was a very interesting exchange. I was in the Museum of Modern Art when the first PhD in photography was gained by Peter Bunnell at Princeton, and he was working as an assistant curator in the photography department that they'd established at the Museum of Modern Art. And he came in, this is like 1968, 69 perhaps, and he said, you will never believe what I just did. He said, I just bought a daguerreotype for $5. And I looked at him and I said, oh, where did you find this photograph that you bought? He said, oh, there was a photography sale at Park Burnett. And
a daguerreotype, is that a glass plate that's used to make the photograph?
Well, it's one of the early photographic processes, and it's actually on a metal plate.
On a metal plate.
Emulsion on a metal plate, and it's a one-off thing. There, you make a daguerreotype, and there's only one of them. There's no negative. The other processes in photography were negative processes, either with paper negatives or glass plate negatives. And so, you have this kind of divergence in the 1840s. So the idea that Peter had actually bought this photograph, and everybody was really quite surprised that, Park Burnett was formal enough to have this Strober sale. He probably didn't buy it for $5. He probably spent $40 for it. That in itself was much more extraordinary than $5. And from that sale, what happened then, and this is really important in photography, Christie's in London began to hold photographic sales, and Sotheby's in London began to hold photographic sales. And what then happened was this remarkable convergence of history and, I suppose, fate. Eventually, photography would be recognized in a really big way. And it happened very quickly in the decade of the 1970s. These sales began in London at the moment that the Conservative Party was thrown out of power and Labour came in. And Labour came in and changed the tax laws in England. And it meant that the people who had the great country houses of England and had maintained these country houses for generations, 10 generations, 15 generations, that had these collections made over the period of, say, 1400, 1500 to 1975, and these people could not maintain their large country houses. So all of the things that were in these country houses, as they were abandoned by the establishment in England, all of them were the objects, created and held in these wonderful houses, was dumped into the British art world through the auctions. And so in about 1975, the auctions had just started beginning to appear, and these objects being dumped into these auctions as a result of these sales were just drowning in objects. And so suddenly you had thousands, tons of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of photographs dumped into a market that didn't realize that photography even existed. And so I would, since I began to take photographs in India in 1959, and it actually worked around the British photography firms that documented India in the 19th century, I was one of the few people in the world, maybe I was the only person in the world, who'd written books and done exhibitions on the 70% of the world that no one was interested in, certainly photographically, except for me. And so, I would go into these auctions, and I would find photographers. I did no place in the history of photography, even in books and in periodicals, was there any reference to this work. And just the sales got to the point where, I would go and I'd buy albums in London, and I'd buy freight bill back to America for buying these albums. Got more and more and more expensive, and this period lasted for about 2 or 3 years, and it's just absolutely unbelievable what was revealed in these auctions. And along with that were academics that saw this material, and there were photographers, and there were designers, and there were gallerists, and that, above all, there was the public, who the public is always very, very curious. They know what good pictures are. They've grown up with everybody in America, everybody in Europe, everybody knows what a good photograph is. You get that from the time you're 10 years old and looking at magazines. And so I was in this strange situation that I had done some exhibitions of India and China and Japan. And I remember being in Jaipur, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years later, and asking if there were any, 19th century photographs from some of the antiquarian dealers that dealt in swords and textiles and art and sculpture. And this man said, "Oh yes, no, I really like this field." And I thought to myself, he really likes this field. This is Jaipur. How could he even know about this? So he showed me this book that he had, and he started turning the pages and looking at it. And he said, "Do you know this book?" And I looked at him and I said, "Yes, I do know that book." And he said, "Well, how long have you known that book?" And I said, "Well, since I wrote it."
Wow. Yeah. Have you met Clark Worswick before?
Yes, I hadn't met him myself really until that moment. It sort of summed up, this. At that point, I've been working in this field for 15 years, maybe 20 years. And, I'd done these books and had a publishing company and my own imprint at Knopf. And, a lot of people had seen, all of those books and gotten involved in the field. And, at the same time, this great gout of photography that came out with the destruction of those British country houses, and with similar things that began to happen in Europe, where every warehouse, every bureau, every attic, every basement was literally emptied of photography. And to me, it was very strange because, in a period of maybe 8 years, 10 years, photography have gone from, no awareness with anyone, the importance of photography and what photography actually documented, had reached, to me, a very surprising conclusion that photography uniquely documented the world in a way that no other medium does. And people really, kind of everywhere were really interested in it. And so this is really one of the big art discoveries, I think, of our period, and particularly for all the people of my generation. Bravo to all of us. Our world is much, much larger as a result of photography and these discoveries than it was, for our parents' period. And, then I go on to the commoditization of photography, and I think that kind of lies ahead, and photography will probably devolve into more of a commodity than it now is. And in that commodification process, I think that people will finally go back to these archives that still exist. A lot of the curators that I knew kind of began to get it in the 70s, and it's really extraordinary when I go back and I look at where photography was. I tried to get into the National Geographic archives for 40 or 50 years, and I never really could. And finally, one day I met somebody who knew the husband. He was the husband of the great German chancellor's, Adenauer's daughter, and she had good social contacts in Washington, and she finally got me into the National Geographic archive. So I got, in after trying, a long time to get in to see the archives, and I was looking at the pictures, and I got to about the high seas. It was all alphabetized, and it just stopped. And I said, well, where are the pictures? Where is China? Where is Cambodia? Where is everything else? Nothing is here. And it sort of came out of the National Geographic in the 50s and 60s had thrown away their archive. It's so crazy. So I went at one point to the V&A and had a sort of similar, situation. Victoria and Albert was set up in the 1860s. And the Victoria and Albert is, one of the great museums of London, and they should have lots and lots and lots of photographs. So I went to their curator, and I'm 19, about the period of those auctions, and I said, I'd like to look at your photographs. And he said, he was the Indian curator. He said, well, we don't have any. And I said, what do you mean you don't have any? Photography was a huge art in the 1860s. These are the years your museum started. And of course you've got to have some, because all of these things, there was the Crown's involvement in all of this. It's a royal institution. Everybody, knows that everything that was being done with the V&A was the kind of fulcrum of the beginnings of collections of Indian and objects, and because it was part of the empire. And he said, well, we don't have any. No, we don't have any. And I got to know him, and I said, well, actually, we do have some. Here, I'll show you. So he took me upstairs into the attics, and he opened a closet. And he said, I started here at the age of 16 as a porter. This is the curator. When I was 16, 1954, I came here, and then I began to notice that we were throwing away all our photographs. So I started collecting them when they were thrown into the bins. And then I'd bring them up to the top floor and put them in this closet.
Wow. Yep.
I don't know what you say. When I went to Harvard, they did the same thing. They threw out the collection given by Isabella Stewart Gardner to the museum in the 1890s. It went off to the Watertown dump. So,
yeah, it's too much. And sometimes I've even heard artists themselves, like painters, could destroy their work. Literary people who've written manuscripts will sometimes just let it go because maybe they don't feel well, or they've had an argument, or they're despondent, or they didn't get a grant or an advance. And so I only mention it because I've witnessed some of these things firsthand, and there's been times when I sometimes blame it on not having a place to store things, but there's other reasons too.
Well, there are emotional reasons. Your artist was married to a certain person, and then the art that he collected reminds him of his wife that he now hates.
Right.
So he throws them away.
That could be the most common.
Yes, I think so. Strangely, in India, the thing that destroyed more photographs than anything else was the monsoon, were floods, were weather cataclysms.
Wow.
So anyway, I don't know. So perhaps what we've been talking about, gives people a bit of a taste of what this world was like. But it was really very exciting to be involved in the repopulation of knowledge about this incredible medium, and it just continues to grow and grow and grow. If you think about the field now, you can still go into auctions and you can buy incredible things because people don't know very much about photography, and they don't know about the rarity of certain things in photography. And so if people just simply study that and then collect accordingly, they'll wind up with great collections, and the great collections eventually will go and repopulate our institutions, and cure these, academic exclusions that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you wanted to ask, Ann?
Well, I would, but I'm wondering if you'll want to think about it before answering. But I'm interested in one thing that I appreciated about Adelaide de Menil, is some of the photographs that I've seen her take are, I think, meet the highest standards of technical photography, but there are others which she was willing to share where the subjects were out of focus. And I appreciated her for simply deciding that sometimes it doesn't matter, and not to try to always reach a bar and a standard for resolution and high definition, although as a cameraman myself, that's kind of one of the main considerations when we're doing a shot, which is, are we in focus? And I'm wondering if you could talk about photography, because some of the pictures, whether it's Walker Evans or some of the early prints, sometimes the definition is fantastic, really, really clear and sharp. And I don't even know where to begin to think about it, whether it's a pull of the lens or whether it was the type of print that was made, and whether it really matters all the time. I mean, but do you think about that too, that some photography, the image, is incredibly sharp? And I think, how did they do it? And that's part of the art form, but not the final definition of whether a photograph is good or not. Because, if you want to see what Mars looks like or some of the first photos from the moon, you get what you can. You take what you can get.
Yes, well, I think, a lot of my thoughts about, these questions that you just raised lead me to believe that photography, because of its predictive nature, meaning that you're always taking a photograph of something in front of you, it's very difficult to invent photography, because what you're then dealing is, you're not dealing with the actual world, you're dealing with an imagined world. And in an imagined world, where you have things that are out of focus that are really quite wonderful pictures, or you have taken a photograph, you're photographing the Zeppelin landing in New Jersey, which has just made a transatlantic journey in, 1936 or 37. And you're sitting there and you're looking at the Zeppelin just docking, and suddenly it blows up. And so half of the Zeppelin is burning, and everybody in the Zeppelin is dying. And you take a photograph of this, and it's just really one of the most extraordinary photographs that you could possibly imagine. I mean, so I have this feeling that a lot of photography, you could say photography is the art of the accidental.
Mm.
And I think that, if photographs are out of focus, well, there are a lot of people during, various periods of photography, made photographs out of focus on purpose, because it gives a, very kind of illusory look, at whatever is photographed. Yeah. And there are whole movements which are, just based on that premise. And the thing about photography itself is that it's such a gigantic field, only bound by subject matter, really, and time. And I think that these questions about the accidental moment in which something incredible happened that somebody photographed, a lot of Cartier-Bresson's photographs are about movement. And he was a great French photographer of the 1930s through 1960s. And he documented lots of very important, periods and places and everything else. But the expressions, the photographic expressions of the variety of his subjects are very much the documentation of the accidental. I don't know if this helps answer your question.
Yeah, it does. And then there's I don't know whether it's a special effect or just an effect of using a Gaussian blur.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a whole different level of photography. I mean, there are photographers now who are working and creating photographs without lenses. Which would, lenses, capture and conglomerize light, onto a light-sensitive material. And the interesting point about all of this is that I don't think that people kind of realize this universe of the image and what people have been able to accomplish. The reason is because there are just so many photographs to go through. I mean, it's like, when I was at the Peabody Essex Museum and came there and saw this collection had been being made for, 200 years at that point. There's just so many pictures to go through. And, this is a work of generations, resolving all of these questions that you just raised.
I don't know whether it was the author Bullock, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, or another, who said, in a kind of warning, a cautionary tale to young children, said, "Young child, as you take the massive paws of your elders, know that your inheritance is the creations made from the beginning of this world, not just a deed to a house or heirlooms, but your great inheritance are the literary works, are the recipes, the songs, the artwork." It was a tale that often people think that the only thing that they're given in this world is a handful of heirlooms or paperwork with deeds and money, but the probably more significant inheritance that children receive is the recorded history of our world.
Yes, I agree. And the recorded history of our world has not caught up to the marvels of photography. We're still, in my opinion, 100 years away from that. I mean, it's extraordinary what is in those archives. I mean, just absolutely extraordinary. And you can see, just the starting point is you can see exactly what a facial expression was on a young boy in 1900.
Exactly. Right. Yep.
As he was, either very, very, very happy, in 1900, or sad, or
coming out of a coal mine.
Yeah. And there's so many levels here that there's so much material. I think we have this great sorting ahead of us, and I think I can't stress enough how lucky we are to have stumbled accidentally into the digital era. I mean, it's incredible. The Kodak company existed for 130 years. Before, not 130 years, maybe 110 years. Before the accidents of digital caught up with, photographic film, which actually, when you look back at it, was not a very acute medium. And digital is 10 times more acute than film. And so the actual, artifact that's being created today is technically so far advanced from, a bromide print made with Kodak paper or Agfa Brovera paper. And yet, each of these things, each of these digital and, paper, remnants are really important in the history of photography.
Yeah, certainly. Well, in case you wonder why I'm speechless, to relay a story, Beethoven gave a performance. He was quite an entrepreneur. I've heard that he would rent the theater or hall himself. that he would arrange for the tickets and would receive the profits or the proceeds from his shows. Quite an independent pioneer, and breaking away from the clutches of the usual people who would fund musicians, whether they were royalty or aristocrats. Beethoven started to be a kind of self-managed businessman, but he gave a performance once, and he walked off the stage, and there was no applause. And he was pretty confused about that. And one of the stagehands said, "Turn around, take a look through the curtain." And pretty much everybody in the audience had a tissue and was wiping the tears away from their face.
What a wonderful story.
Yeah.
You're talking about magic. I was saying, now where is Ian going to pull what out of what box, what object?
Right.
Wow. I mean, that's amazing. Yes, no, it really is. And that, then I think shows you that there's every generation there are people who try to move things along in different ways. And one of the great ways to move along is, I wish that in the art world that people could move away from dealers. I mean, the average dealer who goes, and approached by an artist, wants the dealer to sell his art, will finally, at the end of the day, the important conversation is, I want 50% of whatever I sell, and then I can add on another 10% to my 50% for the crappy wine that I serve at my openings.
It's astounding. That's still the way it is in Soho and New York galleries today.
Yes, it's just horrible.
Yeah.
It's just horrible.
Right.
And the problem is most dealers actually consider that the hard work that they engage in, fraught with great difficulties, is the reason why artists should exist. I don't have a dealer, and I'll let my son, going to inherit whatever I have, deal with him. He's a businessman, and he can sort this out. I'm not.